Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. It's about 5:30 in the morning, Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, right before the U.S. presidential election, or the day of. God knows what's going to happen today and in the weeks to come. 4 years ago, I was shocked and in despair, like a lot of other people I know, and sort of wondered whether I was going to even keep making this show. But I ended up settling on a sort of new mission statement that was derived from one of my favorite books, Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. It's a fantasy conversation between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the end of it, the very last paragraph, not to give away any spoilers since it came out in the 1970s, Kubla Khan is worrying that he'll never be able to see the expanse of his empire and that everything will fall apart before he sees it and well, that everything does fall apart. And at the very end, Polo says to him, "The Inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here, the Inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the Inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the Inferno are not Inferno. Then make them endure. Give them space." So I've had that going for the last couple of years. We'll see what today brings. I guarantee you I will be back whatever happens, and maybe I'll even have an extra episode next week. My guest this time around for this Election Day special is David Shields. David was on twice in 2019, first to talk about his book, The Trouble with Men, and then about his documentary, Marshawn Lynch, A History, both of which came out that year, both of which are really good and that you should check out. This time around, we are talking about his 2018 book, Nobody Hates Trump More Than Trump, an Intervention. That was published by Thought Catalog. It's written in David's aphoristic essay style, and it explores Trump's self-loathing through a bunch of different cultural and literary lenses. It is a fantastic and cutting book, and it's one that I'll be honest, I hope we render it pretty irrelevant very shortly. This is not my usual conversation. This is not my usual intro. I could blather on a lot more, but let's just get to it, shall we? Here's David's bio. David Shields is the internationally best-selling author of 22 books, including Reality Hunger, which was recently named one of the 100 most important books of the last decade by LitHub. The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, Black Planet, and Other People, Takes and Mistakes. Nobody Hates Trump More Than Trump, an Intervention, was published in 2018. The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power appeared in 2019. James Franco's film adaptation of I Think You're Totally Wrong, A Quarrel, which Shields co-wrote and co-stars in, was released in 2017. He wrote, produced, and directed Lynch, A History, a 2019 documentary about Marshawn Lynch's use of silence, echo, and mimicry as key tools of resistance. A recipient of Guggenheim and NEA fellowships and a senior contributing editor of Conjunctions, Shields has published fiction and nonfiction in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Esquire, Yale Review, Salon, Slate, Tin House, A Public Space, McSweeney's, Believer, Huffington Post, LA Review of Books, and Best American Essays. His work has been translated into 24 languages. And now, the 2020 Election Day special Virtual Memories conversation with David Shields. A few days ago, I was in a parking lot and I saw one of those cars where the pro-Trump owner has written like 10 million things on it with stick-on letters. And the only thing I made out was compassion is another word for control. And I thought of you, even though I imagine it's one of those QAnon slogans. But nonetheless, it put me in mind of you and this book and what compassion actually means, and what nobody hates Trump more than Trump means 2 years on from its publication. How's the book evolved, I guess? And is compassion another word for control?
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. That's the whole, there's a lot there to unpack, isn't there, Gil? Compassion is another word for control, is code for, Ayn Rand or Ayn Rand, where that any kind of neoliberal definition of society means a kind of Darwinian dog-eat-dog world, that selfishness is the only virtue, that greed is good. I mean, it's that I am not my brother's keeper, I am my brother's jailer. I mean, it's all there, really. And that I'm trying to understand, I mean, so much of what the book tries to get at and what the film adaptation I'm working on tries to get at is what sadness animates someone, what anger, what rage, what dispossession creates in someone a need to put on their SUV. Compassion is another word for control, which is that the world has let him or her down so desperately. He feels so disconnected, and it tends to be a he, so disconnected from the world as we know it in its hyperdigitization, its multiculturalism, its global economy, that I have everything I can possibly manage to survive on my own. I'm going to thrill to my own selfishness because it's the only possible way that I can survive. There's a kind of self-loathing there, isn't it? Because if you can't, I mean, my God, that person probably thinks of himself as a Christian, which is so preposterous.
Yeah.
The only point of the Bible is to love your neighbor as you would love yourself. And so if compassion is another word for control, I don't know, it's one of the I'm almost crying as I'm hearing it. It's among the saddest things I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, I was amazed, and I haven't looked up the phrase to see if it's one of those Q catchphrases or something, but I was just...
It may well be.
Literally the entire, and you were good to note without my saying it that it was an SUV, that the entire back of the SUV was covered in this. Yeah, it just has to be,
That's a given.
But all the phrases there, that was the one that just leaped out, and I was like, wow, that's
amazing.
Quite a statement.
I mean, part of it is that I try to explore in the book, and I think I'd write the book maybe a little differently now, or maybe even a lot differently now, is that I do think the right, not always, but the right tends to be better at branding than the left. Yeah. So much of what the left is involved in is a kind of genuflection to complexity that our heroes tend to be. I mean, that's what liberalism means, is an openness to other people's points of view. And so on so many, when you say pro-life, that's pretty good branding compared to pro-choice. I mean, how could someone, the moment you say pro-life, the other person is effectively saying that they're pro-death,
Yeah.
and that pro-choice isn't bad, but it's not as, it just as
Yeah.
branding, it's not as good as pro-life. I mean, that's brilliant. That's brilliant marketing. And compassion is another word for control. I mean, that hard C's, compassion, control. I mean, that's a memorable phrase, and it means. I mean, what are they trying to get to there, Gil? With compassion is another word for control. Is sort of what are they
I
trying to
assume it.
evoke?
I assume it's tied to the you wear you wear a mask out of consideration for other people and their health, out of
Oh my
compassion.
God,
And I assume it's an anti-mask,
oh my God, that's so
pro
interesting.
pro COVID, pro death, position.
Exactly, that's fascinating. I mean, that gets us quickly to Trump and COVID, but that's interesting that you went right there. But like, I mean that. I mean, I think about that a lot, and I'm trying not to just ride in on my high moral horse and just, it's the easiest thing in the world, of course, to wag one's finger at Trump because he's awful and scary. But like, how did that become his position that we're going
Yeah.
to try to kill as many Americans as possible? Like, how did that become policy? Like, I mean, I'm honestly asking it. I mean, he could have been, if he just, his whole goal was to get re-elected.
Yeah.
And so that's all he cared about is try to not have the economy tank, have the Dow Jones numbers stay normal, try to feed inside information to my friends who will sell short
Benefit. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
continue to give me contributions. Let's try to make sure Democratic mayors and Democratic senators are blamed. The COVID is only in blue states, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I don't see how ruling over a death cult is going to get you
Yeah.
reelected. I mean, what is or
Well,
was the strategy?
it's of a piece with your book where you have numerous confidants or long-term people in his life who say there is nothing but the present. There
Right.
is no strategy. All there is reelection. And it's why in February, when Nancy Messonnier at CDC says it's not a question of if, but when this is going to get a lot worse, he freaked out on the flight back from India solely because the Dow Jones numbers went down. And that was
Unbelievable.
it. It was all about protecting the stock market. And, just disaster after disaster comes from, the cure can't be worse than the disease, all
Right.
that mentality. And yet, like you say, it inculcates a death cult,
And then,
where it's literally, we even got those statements with, it's okay if I die as long as my grandchildren have liberty and freedom,
that guy,
from
that
some of these
Texas guy,
statements.
yeah, the lieutenant
Yeah.
governor, that, I mean, it's that line I think I quoted in the book, which is, I mean, is my go-to quote from the Argentinian aphorist Antonio Portia. He was born in Italy, spent most of his life in Argentina. And that incredible line of his, man is weak, and when he makes strength his profession, he is weaker. I mean, that's the whole damn book. And that's Trump.
Yeah.
He is, as the book tries to explore, he is, I mean, to me, obviously, an incredibly weak, damaged, insecure, self loathing, death obsessed human being. I mean, who else would spend 15 minutes at the Tulsa rally talking about how when he was walking daintily down the platform at West Point, he was endlessly trying to explain that he had sort of rubber soles on his shoes, rather than just saying, I'm a 74-year-old man and I walk carefully because I might slip. I mean, what? Why is that? I
Yeah.
mean, like, I guess so much of my project, is this great line of G.K. Chesterton, who was asked, "What's wrong with the world?" And he pointed at himself and said, "I am." That's
Mm.
my. I just think that's the crucial human line of your human complicity, that any understanding of the world would have to pivot on your own complicity, your own human flawedness. And what makes Trump such a, to me, a fascinating and pathetic and scary figure is how terrified he is of his own human vulnerability. And that I do think, I mean, that's to me the most interesting argument of the book, is that I think it's precisely what connects him to his base. That they too are terrified, they too are totally lost, they too are totally dispossessed. And he, in my view, shows them their lack, and then he covers over their lack with howling rhetorical excess, to use sort of Lacanian terms of lack and excess. He shows them how unhappy they are, how unhappy he is, how empty they are, how nihilistic they are, how ravaged the world is. And then once he shows them their own lack, he builds a bridge across the abyss with unbelievable rhetorical excess, e.g., compassion is another word for control. I mean, there's lack and excess right there, I think, because lack is I'm not capable of loving anyone. The excess is I'm not going to, nobody can control me. I can kill people at a super spreader event if I want. It's a very unusual definition of liberty, obviously.
Yeah. But it's America. We take things to excess.
Right. I mean, it's, like I'm trying to avoid just being, high and mighty liberals who are mocking the Tulsa super spreader event. And for that matter, the White House super spreader event, a month ago. And I'm trying to avoid being, the media liberal elite who are just,
sure.
I mean, I'm trying to understand it. Like, what is it? And I'm trying to remain, critical of it, but I'm trying to, what is it humanly that drives these people, that drives Trump, that drives all these folks, whether his supporters? I mean, QAnon is just, to me, bottomlessly fascinating how that has blown up. I don't know. Do you have any particular purchase on those folks, Gil?
I'm afraid to look too deeply into it, but I do have in my notes here just this whole Q business with a question mark after for you. As somebody who read Illuminati a million years ago and 70s science fiction and everything else, I get the allure of conspiratorialism that goes into such absolutely batshit crazy excesses like this, where guys are being arrested on the astral plane and there are clones and androids running around, and
you mean
it's just like sure.
You mean that is literally part of QAnon? People being arrested on an astral plane, or no?
That's what I've heard or read, and I'm afraid to go into like the channels themselves to see this stuff. But yeah, it's so. That's off hilarious. The wall. I mean, this is an unfortunate joke I've made for a while now, and I never mean it in a way to slight all the victims. But the whole incel thing, where guys are like literally forming a movement around the fact that they can't get laid and are taking it out on other people, sounds like a shitty Norman Spinrad science fiction novel from the 70s to me.
Right.
If somebody put that in the thing, you would say, well, that's too far, Norman. You got to throw that out. And now it's just. It's even passé part of the culture.
No, I think that whole incel is a powerful metaphor. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's exactly where I was going.
A good role that that it's a powerful metaphor of powerlessness and impotence that then takes the form of rage. I think that's the Trumpian triangle right there. To like, for instance, there was. And somehow I'm flashing on this guy. He was a writer, a lead writer for Tucker Carlson, I believe, or Hannity. I think
who it turned out was writing all sorts of pseudonymous hate screeds.
Yeah, hate screeds, both extremely misogynistic, extremely racist. extremely homophobic, etc. And then, of course, they flashed on the picture of the guy. And, he could not have looked less layable, as you might say. Like the
Yeah.
guy, he just looked like the saddest schlump you'd ever seen. And, where, I'm not judging the guy's appearance per se. I'm not here to,
Yeah.
impose
Shame for
any
that.
shame
Yeah.
anyone's looks. The guy looks the way he looks, but he was absolutely out of central casting for the kind of guy who takes out, he basically accused like this woman who said that she wasn't serious about a relationship yet, and she didn't care to want to get involved. And the guy said to her that if I looked like Brad Pitt, you'd be serious about being in a relationship, as opposed to he, who of course would value what she looked like. I mean,
Yeah.
appearance is part of love and romance, that we're drawn to how people look. It's just an animal fact of human existence. And so to me, that was just a really telling parable, not about him, who just seemed like sort of one more sad sack guy, but the ways in which he was using sort of Tucker Carlson's show as a way to vent. In a way, this idea of compassion is another word for control, precisely, that he feels, I guess I have to a certain degree a relatively sort of psychological take on politics. I think politics is personality writ large. People are often sort of working out their personal psychodramas through politics, and that is true of nobody more than Trump. And, that I just think that whole incel thing is fascinating as this powerful parable or allegory of people who feel impotent in this culture and whose only way of dealing with it isn't to face their own weakness, their own woundedness, but to bury or to disguise that woundedness as pure rage. As any psychoanalyst would tell you, that rage is not a primary emotion, it's a screen for fear and pain. And that to me is such an insight into how Trumpian ethos works. I think part of the argument of my book, which I think is a contribution, I hope, is that the only thing stronger than Trump's drive to destroy is Trump's drive to self-destruct. I think he's that in a way, if the book has an uplifting message, it's that before Trump kills us all, he'll destroy himself, or such is my barely held thesis. That I think he's like a walking patient. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, you use Shakespearean tragedy. Well, in the book, you use the mode of Shakespearean tragedy for being undone. But does it harken back to Greek tragedy, or do we say he has a great man with a fatal flaw, as opposed to a shit ton of fatal flaws that manage to add up to, something popular?
Right.
I just want to figure out how to address, without lessening the horror of what we're going through and the hundreds of thousands of deaths, the irony that a germphobe's electoral undoing is tied to the fact that you can't bullshit a virus. For all the spewing of bullshit, you can't avoid the reality of this thing. And the fact that it's happening to someone who's, everybody knows is a monstrous germphobe.
I know. That's a fantastic line. As you know, Gil, I've always urged you to compose your aphorisms into a book. I don't know if you've already done that yet.
I did a zine. I think I sent you a copy of
that was beautiful.
Yeah, that one.
No, you've got
I'll work on the next issue then.
About a germaphobe and it's too perfect. And I guess that, that does get us to, of course, the infamous P-tape in Russia, in Moscow, which I still believe exists. Where I just, that his only defense, Trump's only defense of it not existing, was him saying, how could I have these prostitutes, pee on Obama's bed, everybody knows I'm a total germaphobe. But I mean, I just think I'm trying to think of where I know what you mean, like that, you know, early on in Trump's presidency, somebody said, I forget, I wish it was I who had said it, but somebody said something like, some event will occur, some embodiment of reality will occur that will that will show the limits of Trump's endless rhetorical vacancy, that a war will occur, a racial reckoning. And you could hardly, I mean, it is, as you say, out of the most pure Greek tragedy, the most pure Shakespearean tragedy, which is, you could hardly have contrived a more perfect uh,
Device.
narrative
And again,
device.
not to lessen, the
No,
true
no,
horror of it, but
no,
just
but
treating it from an aesthetic perspective.
it's
Yeah.
like life is real, life is serious, life is tragic. It is out of, you couldn't, I mean, it's, as you say, a germaphobe in which the virus is meant to show you exactly that maybe you can bullshit, a real estate development, sort of, but you can't, as you say, a virus is a virus. And I know what you mean. It doesn't in any way limit it. It is a global pandemic. Trump did invent it, but he definitely, I just think, as people say, at least 150,000 people are dead, I think, as a direct result of Trump's
Yeah.
malfeasance. And it's weird that there's even an election. The flip, the flip test is always, can you imagine if Obama had been president, of course, during this, he would not be standing. And part of the argument of my book is that the Republicans are playing ice hockey and the Democrats are playing badminton. And I think it's a big question, how do you fight? And I think it's obvious a lot of people have learned from Timothy Snyder, whose book on tyranny urges us to stay calm, urges us just to support institutions, always present back a balanced rhetoric. But sometimes I worry, like how effective is the Rachel Maddow stance? How effective is the
Yeah.
thoughtful op-ed in the Times? How does one fight fascism? This is our moment, and I don't have the answer. I just, and I think the part of the way I'd write the book differently now is that I think I wrote the book at the beginning of Trump's presidency. COVID hadn't hit. The full version of Trump's sort of proto-fascism hadn't occurred yet. I thought it was maybe a sort of televisual autocracy. And so I think I would have darkened the picture somewhat. I don't know if the book felt to you slightly dated in its take on Trump or if it's still held up decently well for you.
Yeah, it worked in terms of setting the framework for who this person is. But yeah, the horrors of the subsequent 2 years, there's no way to address that without, taking everything darker,
Right.
or, being seen as though you're somehow excusing it because of his
Right.
fucked up upbringing. So
Right. I think, the key to the book is that I was interested. I mean, almost all of my books begin and end with a kind of guilty contradiction in myself, whether about race or reality or mortality or war photography or whatever. And I think the guilty secret or the guilty contradiction in me at the beginning was something like, as hard as I've worked to defeat Trump in the first run up and as much money as I'm pouring in to Senate campaigns to flip the Senate in the second term, and as much as I hope and work for Biden Harris to defeat Trump, I think Trump has lost a lot of his performance chops. He's now become a parody of a parody of a parody. But I think the book began with my confusion that as little as I supported Trump in any political area, I was struck by his mad, galvanizing televisual power, and that he is an insult comic who learned huge amounts, say, from Howard Stern, and that I was really struck by the way the book began when I was like as you say that one line, compassion is another word for control. I was really impressed and confused and magnetized and catalyzed by Trump's. I mean, sometimes he just comes up with really, or did come up with really stunning verbal locutions, and compared especially to Hillary, who just seemed and seems to not know who she is and to just speak in bureaucratese. I was really amazed at Trump's performance chops. I think in the book at one point I call him the world's worst, best personal essayist. That
Yeah.
that everything he does, he wires through himself, which in a way is what every essayist from Montaigne through Joan Didion has done. But what those writers do, and what I try and do, is I wire it through myself, and then I show you my own complicity and my own human weakness. Trump weirdly wires it through himself, and then absurdly, braggadociously, then presents himself as God's gift to humanity. I mean, it's like he's a personal essayist, but where all of us go left into our own human weakness, Trump goes right into his own very unpersuasive sense of his own grandness. I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, it's so therapeutizable in the sense that anyone, of course, who's telling you about how big his hands are, it could hardly, you don't have. I mean, it's just so painfully obvious what. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so sad that Stormy Daniels said he has a mushroom-sized penis. Like it's it's so obvious, and the transparent confessionality of Trump is both sad and moving and weird, but also I do think it's crucial at his connecting himself to his base. That so much of what he does, again, sort of like a personal essayist, he talks about everything you're not supposed to talk about, and I think he talks about it in a horrible way. I think, but he is not unrelated to me to certain transgressive writers like Celine or any number of writers, in that he knows to go toward taboo topics always. Like, on Rush Limbaugh, he said the word fuck recently. Like, that's weird.
Yeah.
That's unheard of. And he knows, he fascinates me in a way that, say, Biden is almost as boring as Hillary. I mean, every single thing he says has been,
Yeah. Cleared. Yeah.
has been committed to death. And, there's this great line of Ross McElwee. I don't know if you know
No, I
Ross's
don't.
documentary films, but I'm hugely influenced by his film Sherman's March and his later films like Bright Leaves. And there's no one who's influenced my work more than Ross McElwee. And he has this wonderful line about what makes a good documentary film subject. And he says, person has to know who they are, be comfortable with that personality, and be willing to extend that personality for dramatic effect. And I think something like that, at least at first, was true of Trump, that he knew who he is or was, sort of was comfortable with it. But I think the key was that is or was willing to extend that personality for dramatic effect. Is he as racist as he presents himself? Possibly or probably, but I think he sort of taps his inner racism and then extends it out as far as he possibly can for dramatic and political gain. And in a way, he's kind of a brilliant documentary subject of his own ongoing, 24/7 reality
Yeah.
TV show. And I think that is very different from Biden, say, who doesn't understand that he's a dramatic character in a narrative. And Obama, on the other hand, understood that at least slightly better, or I would say even perhaps substantially better, that it's a performance. And, I'm a writer, I'm, doing some film, I've, done a little acting, and like I'm really interested in performance. I remember when I showed my documentary film, Lynch, A History, in New York. I forget if you came to that,
Yeah.
Gil.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And, afterward, the wonderful sort of theater critic, um, Laura Miller came up to me. I would see Laurie Stone said that Marshawn Lynch reminded her of some of the great 80s downtown performance artists like, Sandra Bernard and Eric Bogosian, Spalding Gray, all those folks. And she says she had three things that they did: never explain, never apologize, never ask for love. And she thought that Marchand sort of did all those things and that he is a great performance artist. And I think does Trump do those things? Sort of. In a way, he doesn't do any of those things, but the way in which he never explains, never apologizes, and never asks for love, I think that's why, or part of how his performance art has come unraveled. To me, he's now asking
I was
for
just going to
love.
say he's literally asking, why don't you like me?
I know
At some of these
exactly,
rallies.
like
Yeah.
begging Philadelphia suburban women, "Why don't you like me?" I mean, it's that's really an ending of the Trumpian brand. But briefly, I was interested in Trump's never,
Yeah.
never explain, never apologize, never ask for love. That seemed a slightly new tone in American electoral politics.
Mm. And when the book is subtitled "An Intervention," who are you trying to reach? Is it Trump or is it America?
Right. I know what you mean. Like I had this, I was trying to come up with a subtitle for various people and, we were trying various things and somehow I stumbled upon that one. I guess to me, the intervention is, and I forgot, what I was, oftentimes a book for me starts with the conversation around the subject is not getting to everything I think it needs to get at, whether it's a book like Reality Hunger started for me when I thought people were talking about James Ryan the wrong way, or my book War is Beautiful started when I thought the New York Times war photography was not being sufficiently scrutinized, or my film Lynch, A History was started when I felt like no one understood what Marshawn Lynch's silence was about, etc. And I felt like Trump, the intervention I felt like was an intervention into American discourse that, in my grandiosity, which I guess has some, Trumpian elements of my own grandiosity, I felt like, it's an intervention, it's obviously meant to be a few different things. One, the moment you think of intervention, of course, you think of, somebody who's an alcoholic and we have to gather their 12 friends and tell them to stop drinking or something like that. So it sort of goes to AA stuff in the sense of, it sort of plays a little bit on therapy language of,
Sure.
can we intervene on this person? And I think it's an intervention, I don't know, as part of me is fascinated to know, would Trump recognize, I mean, there's no way he has seen or read the book, I don't think. But I mean, it's published
Read
by
a book.
a book, right? Or
Sorry, go on.
even has read a sentence of a book that he has supposedly written. Like the books that he supposedly
Right.
wrote, I doubt he has read a chapter of any of them. Let alone, of course, written any of them. But an intervention for me is hey, America, the conversation is not getting this guy right. Conversation from the left is wrong in the sense that places like CNN and MSNBC, all they're doing is having the taxi meter click over in their moral indignation. And they're as much a part of the problem as the right in the sense that they're just, they're covering Trump 90% to Biden's 10% or to Hillary's 20%. And like, they know Trump is or was good TV because,
Yeah. It sells
it's
ads.
like, and that, that we're expecting him to do something weirder and weirder, ever since the Kennedy assassination that we watched TV in order to see something as dramatic happen. And we're still waiting. And so there's that. And then, so it's an intervention into the conversation toward the left, toward academia, toward journalism, toward the media, toward the right, and also toward Trump's, I'm somewhat psychoanalytically inclined, alas, and that, that Trump's, that the intervention too is an attempt to say that people aren't getting Trump right, especially as regards his amazing self-loathing, his self-destruction, how broken he was by a father who despised him, a mother who vanished from the family every way except literally, and how much Trump is enacting pretty constantly. He's become, of course, the tyrant that his father was to himself. He's become that tyrant to himself. And I think the move the book makes that I still like, and that, the film adaptations are trying to explore even further, is that, most mythological figures contain the culture's contradictions. Jesus, Elvis, Madonna, they're wildly contradictory figures, and that the thing the book tries to get at is that a lot of what connects, and you and I have talked about this already, is that a lot of what connects Trump's once popularity is precisely this weird space of self-hatred. I think it's something that you can't talk about because it seems too psychological and too sad. But I think Trump does access people's howling unhappiness, their profound nihilism, their lostness, their dispossession. He actually conveys that. I don't think he's in control of it. But, as Fran Lebowitz said, Trump is a poor person's idea of what a rich person is like.
Yeah.
And that he's so much not that person. He's sort of, a little Abner version of what a rich person is like, who is eating McDonald's on his, his
gold table. Yeah.
On his private airplane, and I think so. Anyway, I'm trying to think of what I'm trying to get at here, Gil, which is the intervention is to say, can we please change the conversation? Stop with the moral posturing on the left, on the duplicity on the right, on the cultural correctness within media, on the hugger-muggering on cable TV, and to try to really get what's going on to me a deep structural anthropological level, that Trump is showing people their emptiness and giving them a bridge across the abyss he has shown them through sheer rage, through sheer anger, that makes no sense, has no policy corollary, but feels very briefly like a WWE match. It feels briefly transcendent. And I think that's just the absolute core of the Trumpian popularity, which feels, maybe slightly on the wane. I don't know. What's your sense, Gil, of November 3rd?
This episode's going to air that day. I
Oh
was
my
going to ask,
goodness. Oh my
you have
goodness.
you have in the book 28 reasons Trump will get reelected. And so many of them, and it's all pre-COVID, as we've
Right.
established. Just for people who are listening who think you're still of that mindset, but so many of them are tied to stifling left-wing / progressive dogma, PC culture, things like that.
Right. Right.
I think those have been trumped by the circumstance of coronavirus and
Totally.
what we now see in terms of this is what happens when you elect people who have no idea how to run a government or want to starve a government, from what happens when there's actually a major crisis that requires people to come together.
I
But
agree. And,
the
and
flip
that chapter.
side, though,
No, I'm sorry.
go on.
Go ahead.
I was going to say your concerns, though, the things you bring up in those 28 reasons, if we see the anticipated Democratic tsunami occur, are those things that worry you from the flip side of where we are now?
Right. I know what you mean, that that chapter is somewhat tongue in cheek, where basically that 20 reasons Trump will be re-elected. It was probably written in 2017 or so. Book came out in 2018, I think. I can't recall. And that basically, it's basically, as someone who has one foot in academia. I teach at universities around the country, and has one foot, a little bit in publishing, one foot in media, one foot in documentary film. That gives me an awful lot of feet, doesn't it? But I have 4 feet like a platypus. But um, it was more me just gathering some notes on what felt to me like, extraordinary. I do think that did help Trump get elected. He did use, transgender bathrooms in North Carolina as sort of a talking point to get elected. I mean, I do think the left has to figure out a way to talk about, core economic issues. And, I don't know. I'm not transgender, so maybe I'm speaking from a point of whatever white male straight privilege. But, I think, that chapter was about, some of the comedies and predictabilities and off putting rhetoric of academia and sort of PC jargon. But I agree with you that, COVID has changed everything. If I had to bet, someone said you had to bet $10,000 or whatever on the election. I mean, maybe I'm naive or optimistic or whatever, but I mean, unless, it's a big qualification, there could be immense bugs in the system from both the judiciary to Russian bots, et cetera. But I think Biden will win. I hope it's a big enough win, like maybe 350 electoral votes. I think there will be a Democratic Senate and Democratic Congress. I don't know. I mean, I think, as you say, COVID has, as it were, trumped everything. And I just think the news is too awful. I just think if he wins this one, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the flip side question of
I mean,
what do you do?
I know. I mean, and everyone pretends they're leaving for Canada, and I currently live in Seattle, which is only 2 hours from Canada. So maybe I'll head to Vancouver. But I think I don't know. It's a tough one. I mean, I'm trying to say something other than just sort of usual rhetoric, but I think um, I do think the left is constantly figuring out how does one talk about these issues without, still trying to win the political center and not descend I'm pretty left, but I also want to win. And so I don't know.
But you also see, and it's something you bring up in the book, I hate to use the term, show trials aspect of far left culture,
Right,
as opposed to the political side, and what gets unleashed when someone is, accused of sexual harassment, but we can't tell you
right,
anything about the accusations, or you're
right.
accused, or you just have to defend yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, the sort of Kafkaesque horror of that versus
Sure.
the nihilistic horror of what we're going through now. I'm not
Exactly.
sure
I know. And they're
which
not
side will fall on.
equivalent. Right. I know. Like, I know.
Yeah.
I think one thing I want to believe in, and I guess it's not a bad way of gathering some of this, is I'm a huge believer, in radical skeptical intelligence. That I was doing a seminar the other day where someone was asking me, how can we connect in a way sort of racial reckoning with the COVID crisis, and is there a connection? And I sort of hemmed and hawed, and I wound up saying something like, in both cases, so much of American history has been a sort of fairy tale children's history, and so much of Trump's dealing with COVID was a kind of Norman Vincent Peale, you know, think positively and it'll all go away. And I think, not to just sort of name check my book, but that so much of what connects them is a kind of absence of reality hunger, that, so much of American history, the way it's told and taught, and the way that there is a legitimate racial reckoning now, is there's a desire for a reality hunger vis-a-vis this history of this country, which is why there is such, uh, a radical deconstruction of American narrative history. And then, in a way, it's the same question on the COVID front. Why in the world could the president not have said, there is a legitimate thing, we're going to deal with it? And he could have been, I think, a wildly popular president, and could have really stormed to a second term quite effectively. And I just think made a grievous political miscalculation, not to mention a grievous human miscalculation. And I think that, a lot of what connects all this stuff is, you know, whether it's show trials or whether it's COVID. I guess I believe in, one thing I believe in as a personal essayist and as a documentary filmmaker, I believe in, you know, sort of the ancient liberal virtue of radical questioning, self questioning skepticism. Like that is in, that's my religion, as it were, which is the Chesterton idea. What's wrong with the world? I am. Let's start with my own human flawedness, and let's not dwell on it in a self loathing way, but let's acknowledge how deeply human, flawed, mortal, weak we are, and build towards strength from there. That seems to me a really legitimate human project, whereas obviously Trump's is precisely the opposite.
Yeah.
To bellow with a kind of ludicrous uh, pseudo macho strength, but to be signaling constantly his own and the audience's own howling internal weakness. That's almost a perfect diagram, I think, of both why I'm interested in Trump and why I hope I'm really different from Trump. That that
Yeah.
I'm really interested in strength and weakness and confessionality and brokenness and woundedness, but that obviously Trump, you know, and I
Uh,
approach it in utterly different ways.
yeah. I was going to say, as a negative version of it, gives you
Precisely.
something to study. Yeah.
Exactly. He's almost like 180 degrees. Like I think of this Howard Stern line, where I don't know if I haven't listened to Stern for decades, but I remember I was just thinking about this the other day for some reason, like how Stern would always say, I don't know if he still says this, that Stern is, quote, hung like a pimple, was a
Oh,
famous
yeah.
line of
Yeah.
Stern. These, at least according to himself, like he doesn't have a huge penis. And there's something so winning and funny. It suggests such self confidence to be able to, I'm sure his anatomy functions fine.
Yeah.
His
But to
his second.
self-deprecate, to give yourself license
It's
to
so
then open
winning.
up on the rest of the world. I learned that
Exactly.
from him when I was like 12. That's why
Exactly.
I share the most unflattering pictures of myself from high school and
Right.
such, just so that I know,
Exactly.
what I looked like. I can now, open up and goof on other subjects and
Exactly.
not take it from the you're at some Olympian heights thing so much as,
Exactly.
you can make it get
And
better.
and it sends such a huge message to me. Like it's like to say that is so funny and gutsy and human and warm. And it's like I agree with you. It partly gives him license to make fun of other people, but it gives him a weird platform from which to speak. Is like, as I like to quote from Firesign Theater, we're all bozos on this bus. We're all going over a cliff that, I have zero access to any afterlife. It's just one secular, essentially nihilistic ride. And to pretend otherwise is absolute madness. And I guess in a way, that's part of what we're saying is like to pretend that, the show trials are true or that, Trumpian, like, I guess I'm really interested in people who, own their and the culture's own chaos. And again, as we've said, Trump takes it and does something awful with it.
Hmm.
And in a way, it's this 180-degree difference from what I think great art does. But he almost starts in the same place of the empty fact of human existence. I think Trump is, in his heart of hearts, profoundly nihilistic. He has no belief in anything or in anyone, clearly loves people only as vectors on the grid of his own capitalist enterprise, has no belief in God, couldn't care less about the
Right.
Second Amendment or so-called right to life, abortion. He doesn't care about any of that. He's terrified of dying in this very overt way. In the book, I talk about how he says at one point, "There's nothing good about the clock," Trump says, and he
Yeah.
refuses to have his grandchildren call him grandpa or anything like that. I mean, he's really childishly afraid of his own death. And I found it, on some strange level, immensely moving that he actually had this insane desire to have his face carved into Mount Rushmore, that he has, or to win the Nobel Peace Prize,
Peace Prize.
that,
Yeah.
that he has these sort of, he goes, well, because obviously Mount Rushmore will fall away too, ultimately. There's no immortality. I mean, the idea of Trump's face being up there is so ludicrous, but like he has a touching, atheist desire to say, what can I leave behind as legacy other than having killed 250,000 Americans? I mean, and that, I think he is like profoundly aware of the emptiness of his existence and the emptiness of existence. In a way, he's like a, a Camus character, an Ayn Rand, or
Yeah.
a Ferdinand Celine, and that instead of then exploring it, which is where I want to go, he then makes this weird move of, um, and therefore, it's almost like, and therefore what? I'm God. He makes a weird move, which is sort of to say, yes, there's this abyss, but look at my really beautiful golden toilet or something like that.
Yeah.
And somehow that here are some steaks I'm selling, or here is, Mar-a-Lago, and isn't this a beautiful airplane? Or here's my golf tournament. I think Trump, in his essential being, knows those are empty signifiers, but it's the only move he has available. And I think it's the only move that American dispossessed have. Like, ooh, ah, that's a golf course. And I don't know. It's this sad embrace between the pseudo plutocrat and the truly dispossessed. And I think, that's the space the book tries to get at.
And I think it's indicative from the early days when there were military casualties from missions that he ordered, when he tried to meet with families of dead soldiers.
Right.
And it went so off the rails that he just never did it again.
That's a
It
really
was
good
one
point.
of those. Yeah, he just couldn't address someone else's loss.
That's
And then we
really,
saw, very recently the whole line about, soldiers are losers. Why did they do this? There's nothing in it for them. But I
it's
really think
fascinating.
I think
No,
that's secondary to the primary moment of meeting those families and realizing I'm not comfortable.
I know what you mean. And that, I
Yeah.
mean, and even fascinatingly, I know everyone sort of name checks the same episodes, but excuse me, but like, I mean, he's now said at least 6 times. I mean, it's fascinating. He said maybe half a dozen times. He's implied pretty strongly that he got COVID from Gold Star families.
Yeah.
I mean, that is so fucking weird, Gil. I mean, like he needs, like that is so
There had to be a
interesting.
vector that he could blame that was somehow tied to an agenda. Yeah.
I mean, that is so telling that like he is so, like I just think that's so weird. Like what is the impulse is to, they're losers and suckers, these people who went to war, and therefore anyone who believes in anything such as glory or anything like that, or courage or pride, which, I think that there is a legitimate critique to be made about, the system of belief that allows one to participate in a war that may or may not be justified. And so, and then, and then to, like, what is it? There's war, and that, that he has no center to himself that would allow him to say, you know, I mean, it's sort of what made Obama both an effective ceremonial president and also, on some level, sort of boring because he was so perfectly ceremonial and ritualized. You'd always say the right thing in a way that you didn't have to tune in. It was a relatively normative presidency. He pushed relatively little politically. He seemed to almost just enjoy, on some level, almost in this Reagan-esque way, the ceremony of the office. To me, accomplished relatively little in the 8 years he was in office. It was in many ways a symbolic presidency, and that Obama would always say exactly the right thing. He would always grieve really eloquently for fallen soldiers or for fallen people who were killed in churches by racist gunmen. And fascinatingly, Trump, when he's honoring Indian, Native American code breakers, from World War II, he tries briefly to play the right role, and then there's something in him that has to break the fourth wall and start saying Pocahontas would not, he suddenly brings in Pocahontas, he suddenly brings in Elizabeth Warren. And it's like he had to do it. He had to subvert the dominant paradigm. He had to go to the taboo. He had to go to this bad joke. He had to fuck up the moment, which in a way is, it's not unconnected, I think, to say Lenny Bruce or to people or, to Mort Saul or to Richard Pryor. I mean, it's
Or to
don't be
Howard Stern.
to Stern for sure.
It's
Or,
yeah, that's the
don't
norm breaker.
totally. And then like that interests me. Like he has, as they say, no boundaries, and I think there's on some level something, you know, kind of it's as avant-garde performance art, it is sort of interesting. And like I was talking to my sister about the book who recently read it, and she's sort of politically about the same as me, maybe a little bit to the right. And I think she looked at the book and she read it and she said, I can't remember, but she said, like, she goes, am I misreading it, or is there part of you that admires Trump? And it kind of caught me. It was an interesting question. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't have time at the moment to address her question fully. And, I think.
But I'm sure she'll listen to this one, so let us know.
I hope so. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if we have to wrap up or not. That might be a good place to end. But, obviously, I don't support Trump. I've worked very hard to defeat him, both for the first term and second term. But I think if I'm an interesting writer, it's this idea of, of W.H. Auburn's, the great art is clear thinking about mixed feelings. I clearly had, I don't know if I still have, but I had mixed feelings about Trump. I despise him politically, but I was fascinated by him and sometimes impressed by his remarkable ability to fuck up the moment, both in interesting kind of performative ways and also in psychologically pathetic ways. And I think that the book attempts to both unravel those qualities of Trump and also to show how crucial they are to connecting him to a political base.
So we will wrap. I'll ask you the last question. Given that we started with compassion is another word for control, do you feel compassion for Trump?
Oh, definitely on a human level. I do. I think that doesn't, I do, which is, I think someone said about the book, you've achieved the impossible, David. You've made Trump seem human, which I think was meant as mixed praise, but I took that as real praise on a human level. I do know how empty he is. I feel that in every gesture. That is one broken human being. And in a way, I think, as they say, to understand all is not to pardon all. I think the way we understand, say, Hitler or Trump or Stalin, is to understand what drove them and what drives them. I don't think that in any way pardons them. There are very real broken things about, say, Hitler. And I think it's really important to understand how self-loathing Hitler was. That doesn't in any way mitigate a damn thing, but it helps us understand the next tyrant, the next monster. And I think the moment that you call Trump a monster, period, that you stop understanding him. The way you defeat a bully is to understand he's a totally mewling baby. And I think he is a mewling baby. Crucial to understand that and take that baby down, as they say.
Yeah, it puts me in mind of Ron Rosenbaum's Explaining Hitler book, where it's that question of, is Hitler himself on a scale of human continuity or something beyond human in terms of being monstrous and evil? And if you put him in that category, what does that mean about how we approach, our understanding of good and evil and how we behave with other humans? But that's a whole other topic we'll get into.
Yeah. How does Rosenbaum answer that finally?
I forget because it's been so many years. I think he keeps him on a human continuity because otherwise you explain away Hitler by saying it's off the pale.
I think that's exactly right.
If you make him inhuman, then you're excusing not just him, but you're excusing everybody who complied because, well, that was a unique circumstance as opposed to this is a human being and you were human beings who did this. So if he didn't say that, I'm saying he did. So that's where we'll go.
Exactly. Well, thanks for the great conversation as always, Gil. I learned a lot as always. I'm never going to forget compassion is another word for control. So.
And if I see that guy again in a Taco Bell parking lot, I will get my phone out and take a picture of the back of his SUV just to make sure and to find out what the hell else he put on it. So
exactly. Well, great to chat.
Cool. Thanks. And like I say, this will be going up election day, so let's keep our fingers crossed and
exactly
get our passports ready for Canada.
Precisely. Be well.
You too.
Okay, Gil.
And that was David Shields. His documentary, Marshawn Lynch, A History, is available on Amazon, iTunes, and Vimeo, and his books like Reality Hunger, The Trouble with Men, Nobody Hates Trump More Than Trump, and How Literature Saved My Life are available through better bookstores. You can visit David's site, davidshields.com, to find out more about his work. He's on Twitter and Instagram as _David Shields, all one word, and on Facebook as David Shields Writer, all one word. And there'll be links to all of those in the show notes for this one. I want to thank David for coming on to talk about an older book, but about everything that we talked about. And I look forward to talking to you guys next week. Now, in the before time, this is when I would ask you for financial or other support through my Patreon and PayPal. We live in a different world now, so I'm not going to do that. I would appreciate it if you drop me a line or send me a postcard or letter to tell me what you like and don't like about the show. But as far as money goes, I'm doing okay. So what I ask is that you support the people in need, institutions in need. Go find the GoFundMes, Patreons, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, whatever. Go support the food banks, freedom funds, maybe the political election defending funds. I don't know. But there are a lot of institutions and people in need right now. The world needs a lot of fixing. So if you can help be part of the solution, then you're a good person. Last note, I still have some copies left of my very first issue of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. It is free. If you want one, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and fill out the contact form there. Like I say, it's free. If you want to kick in a few bucks for postage and production, feel free, but it's not a money-making thing. It's just me sharing my art, such as it is. I do plan on making a second issue of it, but I've been somewhat paralyzed about writing. I'm sort of hoping after today things will open up. We'll see. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.